Hello, hello. This is BIO461, and this is the last video we're going to be doing. We're going to be doing some whiteboard physiology again today, and it's going to be great. We're going to be talking about the lungs. I'm going to talk and walk you through how negative pressure ventilation works, what a pneumothorax is, and the role of surfactant and surface tension. I'm also going to walk you through the alveolar gas equation, how oxygen and carbon dioxide are transported in the blood, and then I'll finish with the oxygen hemoglobin dissociation curve and the factors that shift it. Okay, so to start that, we are going to show you a lung. So this black is the lung, and inside here, the purple lining is, we call it the alveolus. It's microscopic and there are thousands of them, but we're going to draw one because we're going to just want to focus on one. Inside of the alveolus, there's water. It's very moist. It's like breathing inside of a big long tube for a long time, and the inside of the tube will get all wet and moist all of a sudden from your breath. So that's exactly why there's water down there. This lung is very important. The lung wants to collapse by itself. And so that is why we have two separate walls that basically pull it away from collapsing. Breathing is possible because the lungs sit in these walls, or we call it the thoracic cavity. It's surrounded by two membranes. There's the visceral pleura and the parietal pleura. The visceral pleura lines the very, very outside. It's like the shell of the lung. Hopefully you can see that green. Okay. Ooh, not really. That's okay. And then you have parietal pleura. Visceral pleura lines the wall. Trust me, it's there. Or you can just pretend it's the black. And then there's parietal pleura, and that's a little bit farther out there. And in between this space, we call it the pleural space. And it is -3 millimeters of mercury. And so that -3 basically pulls it away from collapsing. That's kind of what a lung looks like. So up here is your trachea, it goes down, and you're breathing air in. And here's your alveolus, here's your lung, here's the visceral pleura and parietal pleura that keep the lung from collapsing. And we call the inside between the pleural spaces called the negative pressure. At rest, the inside of that pleural pressure, like I said, is at -3, and it stays negative because the chest wall naturally wants to spring outward while the lungs want to recoil inward. This tug of war, like it's a big tug of war going on, which keeps the pleural space under vacuum mode so that it doesn't collapse or anything. So when I inhale, my diaphragm contracts and moves downward, and the external intercostals, which are muscles around your ribs, lift the ribs up and out. This expands the thoracic cavity, making intrapleural pressure even more negative. That drop in pressure that we talked about basically pulls the lungs open, decreases alveolar pressure slightly below atmospheric pressure, and air flows in. And then exhalation or exhaling reverses this process. I also want to talk about pneumothorax. It's kind of a big word, but it's pretty simple. It's just when air enters the pleural space. That's basically the most of it. So that pleural space between the black, I guess, and the blue, that is called the pneumothorax. This basically breaks the negative pressure vacuum that normally keeps the lungs expanded. Once that pressure is lost, the lung collapses towards its natural recoil. And ventilation on that side becomes severely messed up, like severely hurt. Air can enter from the outside, like a stab wound can, or from the inside of the lungs, such as when the alveolus the alveolus ruptures and leaks air into the pleura space. So that's what a pneumothorax is. You do not want one. They are bad. And so now we're going to move on. We're going to talk about surfactant. This is actually cool. Surfactant, surface tension, and Laplace's law. So we'll break these three into different three. The inside of each alveolus, like I said, there's thousands of them, but we're only going to draw one, and that blue line that I drew is the water, the moistness of it. So maybe I use red. Give me 1 second. I'm going to use a bigger red so that we can see the surfactant better. Okay, surfactant. Okay, where do we start? So the inside of each alveolus is lined with a thin film of water. That water creates surface tension, which tends to make the alveoli collapse. Similar to how like a wet balloon is harder to inflate. Surfactant produced by alveolar cells reduces this surface tension. So it binds to the water so that the alveoli do not collapse. And so the surfactant looks like this. Kind of like that. But we're going to put it inside of the alveolus. Just like so. This surfactant binds to the water. And so a little fun fact about surfactant. Babies receive and grow their surfactant in the lung usually a week before they come out of the womb. And so it's kind of funny. Sometimes mothers, right before the baby comes out, they're like, oh my gosh, our baby is kicking and moving a lot. We're so excited to join us in the world. Yes, they are, because they have surfactant now. Surfactant basically triggers the fact that you can breathe on your own. When you're a baby in the womb, before that last week, you're relying on your mother's oxygen and things like that. But then you grow surfactant and you can do it on your own. And so without surfactant, you are oxygen hungry. And so smokers and things like that, they lose their surfactant over time. And surfactant is interesting because for us with surfactant, for most of us, we can breathe in really easily, and after a long time of breathing out, it's really hard. For people without surfactant, it's the opposite. And so babies that are ready to come out, like about a week from coming out, they have their surfactant and they are ready to breathe their normal air, and they are kicking around and ready to get out because they now can breathe all of a sudden. And so it's kind of cool to think about that. According to Laplace's law, which is pressure equals 2 times tension over the radius of something, I believe. I think it's the pressure needed to keep an alveolus open depends on the surface tension and radius. And so it looks kind of like this, Laplace's law. So pressure, you see that? Okay, pressure equals, what did I say? 2 times the tension of the alveoli over the radius. I believe it looks like that. And so without surfactant, small alveoli would require extremely high pressures to stay open, meaning they would collapse and empty into large alveoli. And so you might wonder, well, what if a baby is born a week early and they don't have their surfactant out of the womb? What is it like? Well, it's like breathing at the bottom of a sleeping bag. They can breathe, but it's just hard. And doctors can give your babies a little drug that will grow your surfactant and it'll be okay. So, yes, without surfactant, small alveoli would require extremely high pressures to stay open, meaning they would collapse. So, surfactant stabilizes alveoli at different sizes, or just alveoli, and makes breathing much easier. Like I said, when surfactant is lacking, like in premature infants, babies, with neonatal respiratory distress, alveoli collapse. Compliance decreases and ventilation becomes very difficult. Compliance of the lung means it is flexible and squishy and able to move around a lot. And so without surfactant, we are oxygen hungry for oxygen. Now I want to talk a little bit about the alveolar gas equation. The alveolar gas equation estimates the partial pressure of oxygen in the alveoli, or the PaO2. Let's see if I can draw this out actually. So there are certain pressures. I'm going to erase this, and we're going to zoom in on the alveolus. So now that we know what the lung looks like and the anatomy of it. Okay, here we go. So here is an alveolus for us. It's kind of in a different direction than we normally do. And the lung goes around it this way. So we're going to look at it from this area. And then we're going to have venous and arterial blood come by and talk with this alveolus. So this blue is venous blood, and it is non-oxygenated, I believe. Yes. No oxygen in this blood. This blood is coming to the alveolus to receive oxygen that we inhale. Hopefully you can see that blue. That is no oxygen. And then out this same blood goes, except it is oxygenated. And it's coming back to the heart. So there we are. So if you look at the heart, you might see pulmonary veins and arteries. On models, the pulmonary arteries are blue instead of red. These are the pulmonary arteries and veins. And the pulmonary veins are red instead of blue. So it is a little confusing to learn, but it's just blue because it doesn't have oxygen, and it's red because it does have oxygen. Okay, so inside of the alveoli, we have a pressure, and we call that the PaO2, and we can actually predict this pressure, PaO2. This is the partial pressure in the alveolus of oxygen, and this is about 104 millimeters of mercury. That is about the pressure of inside of the alveolus of oxygen. There's also PaCO2. PaCO2. That's the partial pressure of carbon dioxide in the alveolus, and this is a lot less because we don't want much carbon dioxide. We don't want to be breathing much carbon dioxide. There we go. Okay, so now this blood is coming up to kind of get it, and so the alveolar gas equation is being able to predict what the pressure is inside of the alveolus. And so there is an equation for that. Not very big fan of equations. I'm going to come over here. So we're trying to figure out the PaO2. That is the plan. Find that out, you calculate, it equals the inspired oxygen, which is PiO2, and that's inspired oxygen. That's usually about 150 millimeters of mercury at sea level. And then it's subtracting the P little a O2, and that's how much oxygen is coming to the alveolus. So, I know this is kind of a lot of information, but we're going to draw this out. So, there's P big A O2, that's for alveolus. There's P little a O2, and that is the pressure inside of this non-oxygen blood, PaO2. And that is normally about 40. There's also a P little a CO2 that's coming by, and that's about 45. This is coming from the heart, so maybe I can draw that too, so that you know where this is coming from. So there we go. So it's coming from the heart to get oxygen to get sent back to the heart. Anyways, back to this equation. PaO2, Oh no, it's PaCO2. So still the CO2 over there. And then it's divided by the respiratory exchange ratio. And the respiratory exchange ratio is about 0.85 when you're just sitting and resting. When you're exercising, it goes up to about 1. So that is the alveolar gas equation. Clinically, this alveolar gas equation tells us whether hypoxemia or lack of oxygen is due to a ventilation problem, a diffusion problem, or something like a shunt. By comparing PaO2 to the measure P little ao2, we calculate the AA gradient, which helps pinpoint the cause of low oxygen levels. Now we're going to get into one of my favorite things about the heart and lungs here, the transportation of CO2 and O2 in the blood. And so we kind of drew this out a little bit. All right, we're also going to draw a blood vessel in the middle of all this. This blood vessel is here. It has hemoglobin in it. Maybe I'll draw this smaller. Maybe you can see purple better. It has hemoglobin. We talked about that a little bit before. Hemoglobin holds 4 O2s, 4 oxygens each. But there are millions of hemoglobin, so there are tons of oxygen in that area right there. And so we call this the, what is it called? The gas transport? Oh my gosh, I'm totally forgetting it. What is it? The gas exchange. We call this gas exchange. And so to start the gas exchange, we need to inhale. When we inhale, we bring stuff from the alveolus to the blood, and this starts off with bringing bicarbonate out in here, the blood, HCO3 minus, and then that goes into the blood cell, that gets attracted in here. It takes off an oxygen because there's a ton of oxygens around here, they want more. And so it gets turned into CO2, and then the CO2 leaves. Now there's CO2 out here. And so that's a little bit about the gas exchange, but that's not it. We're not done. So we got a bunch of CO2 out here. It's chilling in the blood. And then the CO2 wants to move out, or we exhale. So we're going to exhale a bunch of CO2. And so now we move up. The CO2 goes up and we exhale. There we go. That is basically the gas exchange and how that works. And so oxygen is transported mainly down to hemoglobin, which is about 98% of blood vessels and stuff like that, with only a small amount of dissolved in plasma, blood. And so bicarbonate to CO2 out, and then you breathe out. So you breathe in oxygen, you breathe out CO2. And I feel like I'm missing something here. Oh, so I forgot about this part. The heart is sending blood with about 40 millimeters of mercury of oxygen and 45 millimeters of mercury of CO2. When we inhale, these concentrations meet with the CO2, and now they get sent back to the heart now that they're oxygenated. We breathe in oxygen, meets up with the PaO2 and PaCO2 and all this, because this is how much we breathe in or so, the P big AO2, P big ACO2. And then we find an equilibrium, and that equilibrium is simply, so it's still P little AO2. My red marker's dying. P little AO2, and then there's P little a CO2 still, because it's still in the bloodstream, same bloodstream. just meeting up with these guys up here. And there's going to be less CO2. There's about 40 CO2 that meet up. And there's 104 O2. And so the heart sends deoxygenated blood with not very much oxygen. And then we breathe, and then it just oxygenates our blood. And then it gets sent back to the heart. Here's our black heart right there. Heart oxygenated back to the heart. So the lungs oxygenate the blood. It's cool. Hopefully that makes sense. That's a lot. There we go. Next, we're going to talk a little bit about the hemoglobin dissociation, or oxygen hemoglobin dissociation curve. I want to draw this out to make sure I get it right, but there are things that affect it. And so the oxygen hemoglobin dissociation curve shows the relationship between the pressure of oxygen and the hemoglobin saturation. Its curve is due to cooperative binding. So like once one oxygen binds, hemoglobin's affinity for the next oxygen increases. Let me draw this out. It's so pretty. I don't want to erase it. There we go. Okay, here we go. We're going to start this out. So, in physiology, we like to graph everything. So here we go. We're going to draw a graph. What color should I use? Maybe this one. Big old graph. Nope, we're going to use that color. And this curve can switch left or right. And so on this x-axis, we have the pressure of oxygen, pressure of O2. Let's give a landmark, 40, 100, and this is millimeters of mercury. 40 is like a resting cell. It's resting. And then this is the alveoli concentration. There's that. And then on the y-axis, we have hemoglobin saturation. Okay, there we are. And so the curve is going to look a little bit like this. It's going to go up and kind of flatten out like that. And then we have like, this is our 40 mark, so that you can see it probably better with these dashes. Okay, there is our curve. And so there are things that can shift the curve. Certain factors change the hemoglobin curve, like increased CO2, increased temperature, increased hydrogens in the cell, which would lead to lower pH and increased, there's something called 2,3-BPG. And they all reduce affinity and shift the curve to the right a little bit. And so right shift, maybe an easy way to remember a right shift. Let's see. Yes, there's something called cadet. This is the best way to remember a right shift. Cadet. All of these things in cadet, that stand for cadet, will shift this graph to the right, make the graph look like this. Maybe I'll use a different color. This is shifting to the right. There you go. And then this is shifting to the left, of course. A little bit higher. Yeah. Left. Right. Hopefully you can see that okay. But there's our hemoglobin oxygen dissociation curve. Back to what shifts it to the right. Increased cadet will shift it to the right. Cadet stands for CO2. What else was it? Acid. So like things that will lower the pH. D stands for D? Yeah, BPG or DPG. And then E stands for exercise. And T stands for temperature. Increase of all of these things will shift the curve to the right. Decrease in all of those things, or an increase in pH, will shift it to the left. And so to summarize, all in all, negative pressure ventilation really depends on the pleural membranes and the vacuum that we drew between them. Pneumothorax breaks that vacuum. Surfactant reduces surface tension and prevents alveolar collapse. The alveolar gas equation helps us evaluate hypoxemia, which is low oxygen, not much oxygen in the lungs. Gases travel in different forms in the blood through bicarbonate to CO2 to exhale to convert the blood to oxygen. Well, to give the blood oxygen. And hemoglobin's affinity changes depending on temperature, CO2, pH, and BPG. All of these concepts tie together to explain how we move air, how we exchange gases, and deliver oxygen to the tissues. Well, thank you for listening to my whiteboard physiology. And this was it for this semester.